Siren,
You want me to share my screen now, or you have stuff you're going to share as you like kick things off?
Nothing. Yeah, no, I wasn't going to screen share. I was going to give like a quick verbal intro, just like like, hey folks, thanks so much for coming
Okay.
today. Bit of a vibe about early work, bit of an intro of you folks. But like in the workshop that you've designed, like, do you have already kind of like an intro of like what is RocketBlocks and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I've got like a sort of like background about myself quickly, and I'll mention RocketBlocks in there.
Cool, sweet, sweet, sweet. So what we'll do, we'll just give it like another couple of minutes. Just like getting people to come into the waiting room. Marina, should we do an at here in events?
Oh yeah, I'll do that.
Awesome.
How when you guys have done these in the past, how participatory does your audience tend to be?
Good question.
Participatory. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say the bigger the audience, as in like, yeah, like the last workshop we did was like, what the fuck is Web3? And that was very participatory. Yeah. So I think it depends. I would expect that you'll get like a fair few questions. I think like because we've like curated a group of people who like many of them like actively interviewing for roles. They have like a very vested interest in like trying to get to the.
Okay, I'm going to encourage people to like the way the whole workshop is built is it's really like, hey, let's like work through this question together a couple times. So I'm going to encourage people to participate as much as possible and maybe do some cold calling and things like that. But like
cold calling,
if it's a quiet crew, like it's a quiet crew, it happens occasionally.
Yeah. Cold calling would be interesting. Oh my god, I'm so not ready for like a product interview question. I don't know how to interview anymore. I might just send it to the other APMs at Atlassian. Running, and so you'll give it, I'd say like right now we've got like 30 in the waiting room, but I think we'll get a fair few more. It's morning time Sydney, so people are at work. But I still think we should get like a decent turnout. There are like 200 people who said they were going on LinkedIn, and then I'd probably like slice that in half for kind of the actual attendance. I wish there was a way that you could just like imagine if like you could tell with like a person's profile, like what percentage of the events they click going to do they actually go to, and then you have like a reliability of going score.
Oh yeah, that would be helpful.
Because I thought attendance.
Good luck getting LinkedIn to build that.
Oh, I'm not waiting for LinkedIn to build anything. Earlywork is entirely built on the preface that LinkedIn does not move quickly enough and it's not focused on the right things. Yeah, they're I don't know, like look, it's not. There's some good parts about the product. It's helped me a lot. Shout out LinkedIn.
I mean, it works. They're focused on things that work for them, but like, yeah, they've got a very powerful position built up over time with their network, and
yeah, it's pretty impressive that like everyone recognizes like the career directory, like the social network for careers is LinkedIn. It's like unquestionable. Like you would expect, like in most markets, you expect like 2 or 3 key players, but like LinkedIn just owned it. It's not like Instagram Reels and TikTok and Snapchat. They're all kind of like butting heads with each other.
No, they're like the only professional network.
Yeah. How weird is that? Like, why did a second one not emerge or not succeed?
I'm not sure. My one guess would be that for a long time, social networking was completely seen as something that was like sort of a frivolous thing for your personal life, and so no one was building a professional version of it except for LinkedIn, and then network effects just kicked in. So
wow. Thank you. Good morning. I've given you exclusive access into the room before we let everyone in. Should we now let everyone in?
Yeah, sounds good. I just bumped it in our channel.
Yeah, awesome. So, yeah. Admit all.
Can't stay for too long, Dan.
No worries. Folks, good morning, or good afternoon if you're somewhere else in the world that's not Australia. I think we'll have a fair few folks still rolling in. But given that we're about 5 past, I think we'll kick off with a bit of a cheeky intro. Awesome. So for those who've somehow magically stumbled into this call, my name's Dan. I'm one of the co-founders of Earlywork. We're kind of a career community in Australia, helping young people build the careers of tomorrow across tech, startup, and social impact. So we write a free weekly newsletter, run a Slack group, and we're building a jobs board and talent search engine. My co-founder Marina is also on the call. My other co-founder Jono is too busy watching Nadal play tennis, which is honestly like a pretty fair compromise. Like, if he's going to miss an event, it's pretty good choice. Why are we here today, folks? Product management, very sexy role. Everyone wants to be like a growth product strategist on the blockchain. No one really knows what product actually is. So they'll be part of that in this workshop. But I think when it comes to product management interviews, it's this nebulous, weird world. In Australia, it's a role that's kind of starting to boom. Places like Atlassian, Canva, deputy hiring PMs. But there's not a lot of insight into what is it that interviewers look for in product managers, and specifically, like, how do you tell if someone has just a good product sense, good product thinking, good product intuition? It just feels so mysterious, and no one quite knows how to work it out. Now, very, very luckily, we've managed to get on the call Kenton and Saran from a platform called RocketBlocks. So for context, and they'll give a proper intro, RocketBlocks is essentially a platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews in product management as well as consulting. And fun fact, I personally used RocketBlocks when I was interviewing for my PM role at Atlassian. So it's awesome to be able to kind of now come full circle and give that to kind of the next generation of product managers. So this workshop, Kenton will be kind of like running us through a bunch of interview questions, how to answer them, what interviewers look for, and then we'll also have a ton of time for Q&A. A few things in terms of hygiene. If you could keep your video on, it would just really warm the cockles of my heart. If you want to hurt my feelings, you can keep your video off. That's cool. Keep your mic on mute, just so we don't have like a wild cacophony of sounds throughout the workshop. And at the time, at the end, we will have time for questions. And so we'll provide a way to submit those at that point. Cool. Let's kick it off. Over to Kenton.
Thank you. Let me get my screen share set up here. Can folks see? Oops. That so I can get us into. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. We'll jump right into it. My name is Kenton Kivestu. I am the CEO and founder of RocketBlocks, which, as Daniel said, is a platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what goes into interviewing in product management roles, product marketing roles, strategy and biz op roles, sort of you name it, any sort of role across tech, and then of course consulting as well. So excited to chat on this topic today. A little bit about me, just so you know who's talking at you for the next hour here. And as I'm going through this and telling you a little bit about my background, what would be super helpful for myself as we go through the rest of this workshop is in the chat. Let me know, like, if you're interviewing for product management or planning to interview for product management in the future, what's your dream company and how much experience do you have like going through interviews today? Let's pick like, one is like no experience in PM interviews. Two is maybe you've done some mock interviews or gone through like a PM interview or two. And three is like, I've done a bunch of PM interviews, I've done 50 mock PM interviews and like, really practicing. So let me know dream company, and 1, 2, or 3, how familiar are you already with PM interviews? A little bit about myself, basically a career product manager. That's the way I like to describe myself. I started my career at Google working on ads products. After that, I went to a company called Zynga, a mobile gaming company, actually recently got purchased by Take-Two for about 12 billion. But I ran the mobile poker team there for a handful of years, which was a really fun experience. Built up the team from 5 people to about 35 people and to almost about 100 million in revenue annually. After Zynga, I went to a smaller company called Flurry, ran the ads product team there. Flurry eventually got acquired by Yahoo during the Marissa Mayer era. And after that, I started running my own company, RocketBlocks, which I already told you about. It's an interview platform. Outside of work, I like to hang with my family. That's my son, Charlie, and my partner, Annie there. Spend time with Ollie the dog and go sailing. So maybe we've got some sailors or dog lovers on the call as well. Let's jump in and talk about product sense. So what's our agenda for today? We're going to be talking about a particular type of interview question that comes up in product manager interviews, which are product sense questions. We're going to focus all on that today. We are going to try and make this workshop as interactive as possible. So it would be great, rather than having me talk at you about the whole process, if folks participate and work through these questions with me. I think it will be a better learning experience for everyone on the call. We'll do some comparing and contrasting. And then, of course, as mentioned, we will do some Q&A at the end as well. Okay. Before we jump into talking about product sense, one thing to call out for everyone is there are many different types of product management interviews and different skill sets that they're going to be testing. Does anyone want to, in the chat or just like unmute yourself, aside from testing product sense, does anyone want to raise their hand and say other things that they know that get tested in product management interview loops? I see Dan's raised his hand. Dan, go for it.
That's another classic one is like the whiteboard type interview where you just explain like a project you've worked on and they just kind of like grill you and drill down on like questions about, why did you do this? Why did you do this? Like an interrogation.
Yep. Like asking you something about your resume and like walking through it and exploring the nooks and crannies of that. That's a great one. Anyone else? Anyone else on this call been through a product management interview before? I didn't see much in the chat. Okay. Well, yeah, so critical thinking, someone says not yet. Okay. So I think the way I think about it is that product management interviews, there's a handful of different core skill sets that get tested. One is product sense. That's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into that, I think it's worth you having the context of what else is going to get tested. Other key things that get tested are your technical ability. Like, are you going to be technical enough? Do you know enough about how software works to be able to effectively work with an engineering team? So that's the second category. Third category is analytical thinking. Can you work with numbers? Can you work with data? Do you make data-driven decisions? And do you have enough of that sort of fluency and comfort working with numbers to bring that to the job? And then next thing is communication. So are you a good communicator? Do you work well with others? A huge part of product management is basically collaborating and communicating with the rest of the team. So that's tested throughout the interviews. And then finally, there's a whole host of like behavioral questions that will ask you about your past, ask you, tell me about a time you succeeded, tell me about a time you failed, all that type of stuff. It's similar to what Daniel was talking about. So with that said, product sense is just one of those things that gets tested, but it is a key part because it is something that product managers love discussing, love thinking about, et cetera. So let's talk about like what actually is product sense. Does anyone want to take a stab at like defining product sense, either in the chat or unmuting themselves? Any brave soul out there?
Could it be understanding what the product is? Your basic understanding of the product and how it works, possibly?
It's related to that, yeah, for sure. So an understanding of like what the product is or works. The thing that I would like twist to that is it's rarely does it get tested in the sense of like, hey, do you understand like how our product works, but more in the idea of like, hey, like if you were going to launch a new product or if you were going to build something for X, like how would you go about it? So I'm just going to look at a few of the answers here in the chat. Aaron says an ability to understand why a product would or wouldn't work. Gary said understanding what makes a product valuable. Anthony, why a product would or wouldn't work. Beverly said thought process around product. Product potential. All of these things, I think, are part of what product sense is really about. And so thank you, everyone, for contributing those answers. The way I would define it, and what I think is really getting tested in these interviews when they're focused on this particular skill, is a candidate's ability to navigate from some vague idea, like, hey, build, I heard a candidate the other day that was interviewing at Google say, like, I got asked to build an app for the Louvre Museum, like build an app for them. Pretty vague idea, like you could take that a million different ways. But product sense is basically the ability to take that vague idea to a tactical plan to deliver value to customers. So from some like, hey, let's build this app, or like, let's think about how we could do X. And being able to take that sort of very fuzzy concept and idea and move it all the way in a nice, logical, structured manner to like, here's actually what we could deliver that's like feasible and doable and would be valuable to customers. So that's how I think about product sense. And what I want to do now is transition a little bit and work through a particular product sense question that you might actually face if you were to go through these interviews, and sort of pull this apart a little bit and see what this looks like. And I should mention, and I think you folks are already doing this. I saw Anna just sent in a question. If you have questions as I'm going through this, please either unmute yourself, shout them out, or put them in the chat, and I will try and address them as we go through. If not while going through the presentation, definitely at the end as well. And certain questions, if I see that I'm going to address later, I'll say, hey, like, Anna, we're definitely going to get to that question, and whether that's part of it, we'll talk about that as we're going through this sample question in the next phase. And Naman, to your question, yes, a little bit. I'll show you, we're going to walk through one of these questions now, so I think you'll see and get an idea of what I'm talking about. So first I want to talk about a sample question. And our sample question today is going to focus on the Google product, Google Meet. If you are not familiar with Google Meet yet, it's basically Google's Zoom product. It is a video conferencing product. It's been around for a long time, actually, although obviously it got a lot more traction and a lot more popularity after the COVID hit in the world we've all been living in for about 2 years now. So what's an actual product sense question look like? Basically, imagine that you're a newly minted product manager at Google, and you've been tasked with thinking about an important new project, which is basically designing a Google Meet product specifically for university professors. So actually, before we jump into this, a few things I want to say about this. This type of question for a product sense question is very typical in product management interview processes. Typically, you'll get product sense questions that are based around the products for the company you're actually interviewing for, but not always. So you could actually be interviewing, say, at Uber and get a question like this, or you could be interviewing at Google and get a question about how would you design a new feature for the Uber app, something like that. It does vary. Different companies have different sort of styles, and whether they like to focus on their own features and products, or whether they just want to see if someone can go through this process. A good reminder is if you are coming into a product management interview process and you're not sure what type of product sense questions they might get, do they like to focus on their own features and products, etc., ask your recruiter before you get into it. Usually recruiters will be very forthcoming with that information and share it with you, and that will help you do a better job of preparing and thinking about what you might possibly face. Okay, now let's jump back to this question. So if you've got this question, you're focusing on Google Meet, what I want to do for our first stab at talking through this question together is, let's just start saying, if you got this question, what do you think matters? What are the things you would start thinking about that as you go through the rest of this interview, you're going to want to call out or touch on as you try and answer this question? And folks can either speak in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Okay, so Anna said objectives. I like that. That's a good start. What other things?
Maybe keep the user in mind.
Keep the user in mind. Okay. Good. I like that as well. Current pain points for university professors. That's a good one. I like that word in particular. Pain points, very clear. Jobs to be done. Also, good phrase, similar to what are these people trying to accomplish? That's important. Beverly said why we need the app. I like that. Persona and current journey map. Helen also said user personas. I think that's great. So we're really thinking a little bit about who are these users that we're trying to help. Let's see, Ruby said biggest potential opportunities. Another part of Ruby's answer there that is interesting, hasn't been mentioned yet, is what are the competitors currently doing? How, strengths and weaknesses, good stuff. Naman, understanding the consumer on both ends. I think that, Naman, say a little more about what you mean on both ends of the market there. That's interesting. And then while you're following up on that, a few other things call out. Rashmi, also competitor products features, good point. And then Vivian, I think, mentioned something useful, which is prioritization. At a certain point, probably we're gonna have to prioritize what are we gonna build. Calvin says, what are professors using for video conference? Okay, great. So good work.
Sorry, do you mind if I just jump in and just add in a few, just something I'm thinking about?
Yep.
I would think about this question in terms of like, what do university lecturers do in the real world? So if they weren't using Google Meet, how would they be interacting with students and then taking those actions and see whether they can be converted into like a Google Meet space?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of thinking about it too. Like, what is the current behavior exists, and how can we make that behavior easier or facilitate it better or augment it in some way that would actually be useful. Cool. Okay. This is great. We've got a very comprehensive list. Thank you for everyone for helping brainstorm. So we already brainstormed together. I skipped that slide there. Let me put down a few things that, just throwing the kitchen sink at it. I think most folks sort of started saying like, yeah, we'd have to think about this type of stuff. Like if we think about this, people mentioned competitive products. People mentioned what are the goals and objectives of what we're doing. We talked a little bit about customer segments. We didn't talk about as much about engagement or get into features X, Y, and Z yet, but like, I think we were going that direction. I don't know if we really talked about partnerships or technology as much. Maybe I think some folks sort of touched on it a little bit. But if you think about this sort of process, like if we were just in an interview right now and we had done that all together, and this was our sort of collective answer and gone through that process, this sort of would have been like, yeah, like we would have touched on some of the right stuff. And some of the right topics to consider and navigate through when going through a question like this, but it would have sort of been like throwing the kitchen sink at it. I don't know if that is a phrase that folks also use in Australia. It gets used in the US, and it just means it's basically like you're taking every idea you got and you're just like throwing it at the wall and like hoping something sticks. Like, what are all the different things we could think about? Now, if you think about that from like a standpoint of an interviewer thinking like, how is this candidate doing? Like, is this easy to follow? The big thing that probably should pop out to you is if you're just like throwing out a million ideas, at least you're generating ideas, but the person on the other side of the table may have a tough time following your thought process. They may not understand like, why are they going down this path and this path and this path, etc. So the first thing you want to do as you start practicing and going through these questions is what we just did here. Step one is being able to just generate a bunch of relevant ideas and things that you need to do for tackling this question. But step two, where we want to get to, is being able to generate those ideas in some sort of structured manner that makes it easy for the interviewer to understand how you're progressing through this problem. So this is where frameworks come. And you can either have your own framework that you built, or there are a bunch of sort of frameworks that people know in the industry and sometimes will use. Circles is one of them. Is there anyone on the call that knows what Circles is and wants to explain what Circles stands for to folks? With the caveat that like, I give this presentation all the time and I know what Circles is, and I actually used to work with the guy that wrote the book about the Circles framework at Google, and I often forget what Circles is. So I'll be impressed if anyone knows the whole acronym, but I'll throw it out there. Maybe Circles hasn't made it to Australia yet. Okay. Okay. To be clear, for everyone on the call, it is not important whether you know Circles or not. The idea of our second attempt here at solving the same problem is to do it in a more structured way. So this is what Circle stands for. It stands for comprehend, identify customers, report customer needs, cut through prioritization, which is like a hilarious contortion of this acronym there, list solutions, evaluate trade-offs, and summarize recommendations. So what this is saying is this is basically saying, look, if you get a product sense question, here's a framework you can use to walk through this question. And no matter what product sense question you get, you could, in some sense, use circles. That's at least the idea. So let's take a stab at addressing this same question by sort of walking through these steps. Does someone want to kick us off and say, like, you know, what does it mean to comprehend the question? Like, what's the first thing you would do? And I'll mention as like a hint that like someone mentioned this in the chat earlier when I said like, hey, what would you start by thinking about if you got this question? Go for it, Anna.
I will, hi, thank you, nice to meet you, big fan of RocketBlocks. First, I would like to specify like what the client needs and wants, like what are their objectives, like why is there any limitations and the time frame and everything, and comprehend actually what are their goals, so I can focus on that and start working from that in my framework.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect. That's like one of the best answers I've heard when doing this workshop too. Like, how do you start things off? What does it mean to comprehend the question? But that's absolutely right. It's what the framework is saying is this is your opportunity to just make sure you got the ground rules straight. Are there any goals that the interviewer has in mind aside from what they've told you? Are there any restraints, like you mentioned, like how quickly does it need to be built? Things like that. You want to be able, this is your chance. And I think maybe someone else mentioned the same thing, but to also just ask clarifying questions. Like sometimes you'll get these questions and this question is like relatively simple, but sometimes someone will like sit down and basically like, you know, go through like 2 paragraphs of background and throw out a bunch of details. And, you know, you may be trying to like keep all that in your head and it's a lot. So if you miss something or something wasn't clear, this happens less in product management interviews, more on the consulting side, but sometimes people will like throw out specific numbers there and they expect you to remember those numbers. So this is your chance to comprehend and ask those questions. Step number 2. Anyone want to take us through does anyone want to take us through like step number 2 and step number 3? I think a bunch of folks on the call, you were all chatting about this in the last one and talking about, you know, how you might do this. So who wants to take us through that?
I'll give a whack at it.
Go for it.
Thank you so much for hosting this session. The second part would be identifying your customers, would be like identifying stakeholders and identifying like who those people are, what their age. It's almost like customer segmentation, but their age, gender, race, whatever may apply in regards to how the product or who you're aligning the product with. And then the third would be reporting customer needs. It's almost like after you complete the requirements analysis for whatever the project or whatever the product is, and being able to, I guess, take that back to the team or whoever's working on the project, and being able to share that so that everybody can kind of pull their piece together in regards to what the customer needs may be.
Sure. And so
getting it across the whole team.
So conceptually, I'm aligned with what you're saying there, but take it a step deeper. In this particular case, like if you're applying circles to this question, who are the customers? How would you like identify them and how would you start thinking about some of their needs?
Sure. So I guess the first things were around the questions of what are the day-to-day activities that university professors do, like just in general, like their overall task list or day-to-day activities. Then going a step further would be how are they currently meeting and what is their current way of meeting or scheduling meetings and interacting with whether it's students, the administration, or the university as a whole. And then another layer would be somebody else mentioned what existing products do they currently use and what would be the most beneficial, I guess, features of that product, or what do they use the most, or what do they find most valuable, or where is it that the current product that they're using is not meeting their current needs within engagement for I guess a meeting or telecommunications tool.
Got it. Okay. So I think there was a lot of good stuff what you shared there. I think there was a lot of stuff on like getting into like what do these people need there. I think one of the things, like if I were using circles to solve this question,
और यहाँ से कॉपी किया, इसको पेस्ट किया, ये कहीं से पापा है उसको, वो मैंने प्रोडक्ट का बनाया था, प्रोजेक्ट का बनाया था।
Mighty
no
fine.
context. I just wanna
If everyone could mute quickly, because it sounds like there's someone having a side conversation. Thank you. So what I was going to say is on the identify the customer stage, one of the things I would focus on is, okay, like, you know, it sounds like we're focused on really university professors here, like they're the particular customer we care about. So can we go a step deeper into thinking about, okay, well, what type of university professors are we talking about? Are there different segments of university professors? And someone mentioned the idea of, you know, segment by age, segment by gender. Those type of things can be useful for a lot of products to segment by those things. But if you're thinking about this particular, like we're building a video conferencing product for university professors, when I'm thinking about the customers and identifying them, I would start thinking about, well, maybe there's professors that teach big lecture-oriented classes. They're teaching to 500 people. Like what are the sort of challenges that sort of professor faces versus what are the challenges that a university professor teaching a small forum-based discussion class with 15 students? And maybe those are different. Or maybe a better way than the size of class to think about is what's the content that they're teaching? Maybe teachers that are teaching computer science need something very different than folks that are teaching English, for example, or history, that type of thing. So I think about different ways that you can try and segment and think about who are those customers and what do they look like. And then when you get into it, it's like, okay, what are the needs of those different customers, and going through a process where you're sort of listing out, okay, like they may have this pain point and they may have this pain point and this is something they need to do. And that's tough today in the current world. Or, you know, like, hey, you know, they're already doing this in the current world and that works pretty well. So there's different considerations, and that's really that third step where you want to explore what are those customer needs. And then let's say you've got like, well, actually, let's open this up. Does someone want to just shout out what you think? Like, you know, tell me about a particular segment of university professors, and tell me, you know, what do you think 3 of those top needs might be?
I just had a comment. Are we like stating our assumptions here? Like, are we assuming, I guess I would sort of back up and ask the question, like, do they need the app to talk to other people at the school, to admin people, to students? Because if you design something for students and the teachers, is different from like a teacher to actual teacher. So I would sort of back up and sort of figure out who, like why they need the app and what is it supposed to, who are they talking to? What do they want to do within it before I start to identify?
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. And it's something that, as I was just going through it, for me, that was an assumption, right? Assumption I made, but that's something you would definitely want to do, or at least have a discussion in that like comprehend phase, right? Like, are we trying to, is this for just like administrators to talk to each other, or is this for educators to actually deliver educational content? But, you know, you're the candidate going through, so you can sort of put a stake in the ground if the interviewer is not saying, hey, you have to think about it this way or that way. So again, I'll put it out there. Does anyone want to take a stab at saying, like, here's a particular type of university professor I would design for, and here's what I think, you know, some of their top needs might be? Let's do Jasmine, go for
it. Hello, I'm doing my PhD and my professors work in diabetes psychology research. I think top 3 would be making it really simple to use. They really often struggle with the video technology. Something I don't think I've had on the call yet is about meetings of international groups. So having the capacity to look at different time zones and find a time zone that works if you're working with European groups. When it comes to teaching, having an easy way to put people into breakout rooms and facilitate discussions.
Okay, cool. So that's like 3 needs. Do you want to take us a step further and take us through like that 4th stage of like prioritizing and how you might think about like which of these problems is the most important to solve, the simplicity aspect, the breakout rooms, or the the international angle that you were talking about?
I think the simplicity aspect, because that enables everything else to work smoothly.
Okay. Okay. And then roll with it. Take me to list solutions. Like, how do you make a super simple like video conference functionality? Like, what are you gonna tell me? Take me from that idea to like, what does it mean to have like, you know, a simple app to like in practice, how should we manifest that?
I think it'd be, like people said previously, good to ask what people find the pain points of current competitors are. Like, what do people find difficult about the existing products, and what do they wish was simpler there? Because, and I think even if you were able to watch in on a call, I can see my professors getting really frustrated and actually watch them using the product and what they're struggling with, and then go from there.
Okay, awesome, cool. Does anyone else does Ruby or Helena or some of the other folks that are chiming in via chat wanna share, unmute and share their thoughts on like the sort of segment and prioritizing which pain point to address?
Sure. Maybe you could have some kind of tool within the app that can like sort of do live translations really well, just bumping off that idea about having international students. I think that's something that other similar competitors seem to lack, and it's something like I haven't seen implemented really smoothly before. So that could be a big benefit.
Cool, interesting. I like that idea. Awesome. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm gonna move on, and I'm just gonna take us through a little bit of the end of the circles framework. But the idea here is that you would progress through this, right? Like, so we start with comprehend. We understand exactly what the question's asking. What are the constraints? We try and identify who our customers are. We talk through some of those needs, pain points they might have, suggest a few different ideas. And then, you know, like, what are some of these, you know, the ideas is like, what are some of these solutions that we could approach? There's this step, the second from last, about evaluating trade-offs. And so that would be like, hey, we're going to have a discussion about like, well, like we could really focus on this internationalization and doing, you know, translation on the fly, or we could lean into simplicity, and how should we trade off those are two very different things. What should we focus on, especially if we have limited resources, limited time, et cetera. And then at the end, you would make a recommendation. So if you were a candidate going through this process and you got this question and you said, look, like, I'm not going to bother overthinking it. I'm just going to take circles and I'm going to use that and like sort of step by step, just use it to walk through the question. I think the end result would be that what you have is you will be able to deliver an answer that's at least fairly structured, right? Compared to where we started, where as a group, we just like, everyone was like, oh, here's the bunch of things I would think about. And it was like a very, like, if that's how you approached it in the actual interview, that would be a very sort of haphazard way, even if you touch on a lot of good topics. Circles does a good job of standardizing and giving you a logical thought process to sort of flow through from like, hey, like, we're going to figure out what exactly the question is, then figure out the customers, et cetera. The downside of something like circles or any other framework out there is that when you start getting into these interviews, there's a million different types of product sense questions. There's a million different flavors. They sort of start at different levels of depth and detail and things like that. And so circles isn't always going to be like the perfect way to approach it. It may feel a little bit contrived or maybe a little bit canned if this is basically you know, your only approach for walking through a product sense question. So ideally, I think where you want to get is to what I'll call approach number 3, which is basically when you get a question like this, to be able to put forth to your interviewer a targeted framework of, you know, here's how I would think about this problem. Here's the key buckets and issues that I want to review to come up with, you know, a good solution to this. And then spend your time in the interview for the next, you know, half hour, 20 minutes, however long it is, actually walking through that. And a bunch of folks on the chat right now, I'm reading some of the answers coming in, are suggesting a bunch of things that I think, a bunch of topics that I think are valuable and that you might want to include if you're building sort of your own framework for how to approach this. So I have a targeted framework example that I might use to approach this question, this specific question. But before I show that to folks, I'd like to ask, does anyone want to take a stab at saying, okay, now like thinking about what we've talked about in the last two, like if I were going to say, okay, like here's how I would approach this question. Here's the key things I want to look into. Does anyone want to take a stab at articulating that? And let's see if we can get some new voices. Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I'd look for so what kind, besides segment the professors into different subject areas first,
okay.
And then I try to find something unique from each segment,
okay.
And then I could weight which segment has the biggest problem. So, for example, if there's a general problem like simplicity, and every segment suffers from this problem. Say, for example, the dialing function and the audio, like internet audio. A lot of people have issues with that. So a solution would be to create, like you enter your phone number when you register for an account, and you have automatic dialing. So as soon as you join the call, you have the option for Google to automatically dial your phone. And that's something that everyone's familiar with, a normal phone call. So that kind of, so understanding like, if that's the priority, then that would be a solution. But then also it's just like really defining, what are the general problems that all the segments face. That can be solved. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And what was your name?
Gary.
Gary. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Anyone else want to give an alternate approach for how they might address this problem? And just quick sort of reminder in terms of like approach, what I mean by that is just give me like hey, here's the 4 or 3 like key things I would spend my time, researching and digging into in the rest of this interview to arrive at what I think would be a good, thorough answer. Let's get one more contributor out here before we jump to my sample idea. Do folks use the term cold calling in Australia? Is that a term that people are familiar with? Is that what they call it in university there, or uni? I think it's uni, right? Everyone says it's uni. How about Naman? Do you want to walk through and give us your idea for like a framework? Sorry, I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
No, that's 100% okay on my end. It just might be a little bit noisy because I'm outside. It's like 5 a.m. here where I am right now. But
it's quite a wake up call.
I guess like understanding, as everyone has said, understanding how professors use it, trying to simplify it and everything like that. But one thing I want to talk about is like, what about the students? If we want to target that segment, because at the end of the day, right, it's about, with uni or any type of like learning, it's about what benefits the student. So it's like, how can we integrate the simplicity for professors, and how can we make that interaction between the student and the professor like easier, by visualization or like however students learn, right? So it's allowing an array of options for professors to use their different techniques and allowing students to like interact with those techniques as well. So for an example, right, like one of my professors in my biology course, he used to interact with like Legos and some models as well. So let's say he like got an image from Google Images, and then just started annotating, this is this segment of like the ribs, or the lungs, something like that. Trying to make, so as a student you're visually seeing it, and as a professor you're interacting with your class. I think that's a good targeted framework that would work.
Awesome. Thank you, Naman. And appreciate you being a good sport about getting cold called and contributing despite the early time frame.
That's okay. Thank you.
Let me show you sort of like my framework that I might use to approach this question. And one thing I want to call out that I think, and this is really typical when you're at the beginning end of practicing going through these product sense questions, there is a tendency to want to dive in and really talk about, okay, like what are the features, like what can we build feature wise, like the particular biology example Naman was talking about, or on like the internationalization, like we could do like transcription on the fly, things like that. One of the things you want to really keep in mind is when you build a framework for going through these, remember that part of finding, part of a good answer to these type of questions is that you set up the exploration process well, so that you spend some time thinking about, okay, what are the goals? What am I trying to solve? What are the needs? And then you spend some time about, what could we do to address those needs? But if you jump too quickly into just like, we could build X or Y or Z, one of the things that your interviewers will always wonder is, well, like, yeah, like we could build a bunch of different things, but like, why? And like, why should we build that? And how do we know that like, that's the right thing to build? So here is sort of framework I would put together and think through. And the first thing I would start with is like my hypothesis or problem statement is like, should we build a Google Meet functionality for university professors? And importantly, I do want to call out the fact that it's like, should we build? Because I think there's a question of like, yeah, like was asked to build university, like a product for this group. But I think the first thing you should always ask yourself is, does it even make sense? And as we go through and evaluate these different things, we'll get a better idea of whether there's a real opportunity here and it makes sense to build something. So the first step in my framework would be goals. I would want to spend some time upfront in this interview figuring out what are the goals. What are the goals at the company level that matter? How do those goals then filter down to my product org level? So maybe Google Meet is part of, I forget what Google calls it now because they keep rebranding it, but whatever Google's Office competitor, Google Cloud, I think is maybe the roll-up term now. What are the goals for that organization? And how does that filter down to this effort? Like, why are we even interested in building a product for Google Meet professors? Are we thinking about revenue? Do we think we can make a bunch of revenue doing that? Or do we just think user growth? Google Workspace, thank you, James. Do we think user growth is important? Are we pursuing other things? Do we just think it's important to have good relationships with universities? Is it an altruistic effort? Do we think that we're Google and we've got a ton of money, so we should just help professors in schools because education is important? Like, what is our goal? And the reason I want to start there is I really want to have a clear idea of what the goals are, because if I don't know what the goals are, I'm not going to know what exactly user segment to feature, to end up focusing on, and what features to build for them. And importantly, when you spend some time up front in the interview focusing on this, and you may ask some questions, what are the goals? What's been set out? Know that like your interviewer may say like, hey, there are no goals yet. What do you think the goals should be? That may happen, in which case you have to say like, hey, I think let's pick focusing on X. You may be asked to put a stake in the ground. That's totally fine. But regardless of whether you have to define the goal or there's some existing goals, before you get into designing features and thinking about segments, you want to know like, where are you trying to go? It's really hard to get anywhere if you don't know where you're trying to go. So that's the first step for me. Second step for me is, once I know the goals, what are we trying to do, is I would spend some time focusing on the segments. So what are the different segments of university professors that we're trying to serve? Maybe it's engineering versus the arts. Maybe it's big classes versus small classes. Now you think about, what are the pain points for these users? Maybe it's things like some of the pain points are like, how do I even know my students are listening? Are they paying attention, or are they just like on their phones, like, you know, on like Tinder or dating apps or whatever, or Reddit? You know, how do I drive interaction in the classroom? How do I keep my students engaged? How do I present effectively? How do I drive discussion in breakout rooms? Like, there's a ton of different pain points. Maybe, you know, as I can't remember, was Anna or a few folks were talking about just like, how do I make it easy for a professor to start? Like, older professors may be intimidated by doing everything over video conference these days. Like, how do I make it super simple for them and to keep track of like the polls they're running, that type of stuff. So I just want to walk through all of those pain points and get them all out there. Just like a sort of brainstorming, it's like, there could be this pain point, there could be this pain point, et cetera. Go through that whole process. And then, okay, well, what could we actually build to address those pain points? Which of those pain points do we think are the most important? And then what could we build to actually address them? So this is the part where you get to talk about, okay, like, I think these 2 pain points, but I'm going to focus on these 2 pain points. Here's why. And like, here's what I think we could build. Like, I think the biggest pain point really is that most professors are just intimidated by using video conference software, and they don't know how to do it. And so it intimidates them. And then they sort of bumble through their presentations, and the learning experience is worse for students. So what I'm going to focus on is just making the most easy, dead simple way for them to communicate over video conference. And then here's, you know, how I think we could do that. And then the last big bucket that I would spend time on in this interview is, no matter what I end up proposing, okay, like, we're going to build this super simple video conference product that, you know, has like X or Y things that make it super simple. I want to spend some time at the end saying, like, how are we going to measure whether this is actually working or not? And then how could we iterate on this? Because almost every software product is a living, breathing thing. It's not something that's just built once and put out there. It's not like old box software. Everyone on this call is probably too young to remember that, but like, you used to go to a Best Buy or you know, a computer store and literally like buy a box that had software inside, and then you go install it on your computer. And once it was installed, like, that's whatever came on that CD or disc, like, that's what the software was. These days, it's all over the web and it's all evolving constantly. So what are we going to measure? And it is crazy that we still do that with video games, by the way, Dan. And what are we going to measure? And then how are we going to make things better? And that's where I would end up. So if you think about it, like, my roadmap, my framework for walking through this question will be understanding, like, you know, why are we trying to do this? Should we do this? So what are our goals? What segments are we going to focus on? What features could we build to address the pain points that those segments have? Prioritize them, and then how will we measure if that's actually working? And if you think about, I know we're running out of time here, so let me just quickly finish this, and then we will jump into just open Q&A. If you think about the 3 approaches that we went through in this workshop now, we had our first approach. That was the kitchen sink approach. It was like the MAT, what I'll call the MAT approach. Was it structured? No, we just like threw every idea we had at the table. Was it targeted? No, it was not targeted. Was it unique? I don't know. Maybe it was unique. We just threw out a bunch of random ideas. Like, we just took every idea that came in the chat window and said, that's our answer. We'll talk about all these things. Okay, so that was like an okay approach, MAP. Our second approach, where we use circles, you know, it's like a little better, right? It was structured. We had like a clear process for walking through the question. We comprehended it. We talked about some user segments, threw out some, you know, pain points that they had, talked about some features you could build. Is it targeted? Yeah, like maybe-ish, depending on the question you get. Following that specific process may or may not have fit as well. That's always the challenge with just pulling like a framework off, you know, off the shelf and using that. Was it unique? Definitely not. Circles gets used so much, at least in the US, that companies have started saying, like, if I give you a product sense question and you start walking through like the circles framework, I'm almost like gonna immediately just like ding you, because it doesn't feel like you're really thinking about the question I gave you. You're just saying, like, you're just walking through a framework. You're like memorized a framework and you're just sort of walking through it. And then compare that with our last approach, right? Was it structured? Yeah, it was structured. We had like a specific framework that said like, here's how I'm going to think about this question. Was it targeted? Yeah, like I had a very specific problem statement about like, should we build this for university professors? And then had a few specific sort of buckets of here's what we're going to investigate to come up with an answer to it. And was it unique? Yeah, like it was a framework that we made on the fly to address this specific question. So as you are preparing and thinking about going through these interviews, this third stage is really where you want to get to a point where someone gives you a product sense question like this, and you can say, okay, like if that's a question, like here's the things that pop to mind. Like here's how I would want to walk through it. Here's my framework for addressing it. And now let's start walking through it. It may seem intimidating, especially if you're new to this process, that like, hey, like how would I actually like generate this framework on the fly? Well, the good news is that like there's a lot of like standard topics that are going to come up over and over again if you're going through this. Like, hey, I'm probably going to need to think about goals or objectives in most cases, unless someone starts a question and says your objective is to drive revenue up by 5%. Then you're like, okay, maybe I don't need to start with objectives. I can just jump into like users and features and how we're going to do that. But you know, as you practice doing these questions more, it gets easier and easier to build them on the fly. And even if it seems intimidating today, it's not rocket science. The more you do it, you'll get better at it. Okay, I'll finish here. We'll do Q&A. The last thing I'll mention is that if you're thinking about, well, how do I get better at that process? Like that is explicitly what RocketBlocks is built to do. It helps isolate these different skill sets that get tested in interviews. So product sense, technical ability, analytical ability, leadership, your style, things like that, and gives you questions and drills that help you practice answering those exact questions, and then lets you compare your answers to experts that work as product managers at leading companies today. There's a discount code available. It's 25% off a monthly subscription to RocketBlocks for all of the attendees of this particular workshop. It's Earlywork 22 down at the bottom of the slide. And thank you everyone for joining, and I'm happy to do just open Q&A now and answer any questions with the remaining time we got left. And I can stay a little bit late because I know I took most of the time there trying to get through that.
Awesome, Kenton, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I actually need to probably look through my frameworks, but yeah, super cool case study, and loved like how there was just kind of such a variety of approaches, great suggestions from the crowd. Folks, if you look at the Zoom comments, I'll just bump it again, but we've got a Q&A poll thingo on Slido. Not a bad product, could it be improved? And so we'll probably just run from the first kind of few questions on there, just based on votes. Probably won't have time to answer all questions today, but we've got in the Earlywork community, if you're not already in there, we've got a product channel in there where people can keep asking questions just about product management, product interviews, and so forth. So if you're not in the community, you can hop in here to have a chat and keep on learning. Cool. We'll kick off with the first question here. Top question is an anonymous question, spooky, mysterious. Ken's a question for you. What kind of personality types do you think are best suited for PMs? And then kind of I suppose an implicit question there is like, what are the most stressful and ugly aspects of the role?
The personality types that are best suited for PMs, I don't know that there is a best type. I've seen extremely introverted people be good at this job. I've seen very extroverted people be good at it. I've seen very technical people be great at the job, and I've seen people that are not super technical at all. I think product management is a job of many hats. That makes it a very tough job. On the flip side, it makes it a job that really like you can come to this job and bring very different types of expertise that can make you spike as a PM and help make you great at being product management. It might be very different than why someone else is good at it. So I don't think there is a core personality type. I would say one thing that you need to be comfortable with to be a good product manager, but like everyone can practice this and get better over time, is you need to be comfortable making decisions. Some people like don't like to make decisions, or they want like all the data. You need to be comfortable just like putting a stake in the ground saying like, look, based off what we know today, we're going to do X, and like we'll come back and like change it if it's wrong. What are the most ugly aspects of the role? I think in big companies, the most ugly aspects of the role is there tends to be a lot of just collaborating across multiple teams and trying to coordinate goals and efforts, which especially at really big companies can start to feel very bureaucratic. And then it feels like less about like thinking about users and needs and features and like, what are we going to specifically build, but like, hey, like my team wants to do this, but this other team's doing this. And we both sort of depend on like this common team that's like doing something else. And then you spend like most of your time trying to figure out like how all of you can work together versus thinking about like the users and the needs and how you're going to solve for this. I could just keep going down the line, Dan, to just sort of try and knock off as many of these as possible. You don't have to read them.
Probably, yeah, whatever you have time for, maybe like you kind of like the first 5 or something.
Okay. What capability do you often see lacking the most from PM candidates? It depends. You know, it's hard. I don't know that there's there's a lot of people that are interested in getting into product management today that just have no technical background and need to build some level of comfort with technical stuff. So that's often a big challenge for folks. But I do think, you know, what's actually lacking in candidates aside from the technical stuff, product sense is a big one, because it's tough. Like, it's such a weird thing to be able to sort of navigate from like a super vague product idea to then like something like tactical that you could actually build and measure and be good at sort of traversing that spectrum. So I would say being able to do that well, that's often lacking. Nico, how much technical knowledge should aspiring PMs know? Is there a baseline level, even if the job doesn't require tech code know-how? Very good question. My answer on this is I do think there is a baseline. We cover a lot of this in RocketBlocks, but I think the key topics that you want to have some familiarity on are like, what is a tech stack? How does it fit together? What's the difference between like front end, back end? What technologies get used on the front end? What gets used on the back end? And hey, if I want to build feature X, am I talking about changing stuff on the front end or the back end? And having some understanding of how like a product fits together at a high level, at an architectural level, is more important than being like, hey, I know how to write like an if loop in Python, or I know how to say Python, because you're not actually really any production code as a PM, but you will be expected, and your job will sort of depend on your ability of knowing things like, well, it's really hard to build feature X because that would mean we need to change the database in this way, and that's complicated. Or hey, it's really easy to launch this feature because it's just like a super simple like change on the front end. We'll just like move the button from the left to the right. So tech stacks, APIs is another key one that's really important to know. It just powers so much of how modern software works. So understanding APIs, and then databases. Like if you understand like APIs and you understand databases and you have a good sense of the tech stack, that usually makes you like, you've got all the right components probably to start working and managing software products and be comfortable enough from a technical standpoint. Anonymous, do people hiring for PMs look for particular degrees, or is that not really an issue? Good question. I don't know as much about what the Australian market is like. In the US market, there's historically been a very big bias toward hiring folks that have a CS degree for the PM role, so much so that like, I think it's frustrated a lot of people that are trying to break into the role. But I think the good news is, at least in the US, that bias is changing. A lot of the big companies are realizing that there's a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life that make great product managers. You don't need to be technical to be a great PM. The bias historically has come from the fact that since product managers will spend so much of their day working with engineers, that if they can't communicate effectively with the engineers, that's tough, and things will break down. And therefore, the safest thing to do is to hire someone who has a CS degree into product management, because that person probably knows how to talk to engineers because they were technical themselves. It's a bad assumption. And like I just said, like you can learn the baseline technical topics to Nico's question, but that does happen. I think the good news is for anyone on this call that's not a CS major, it's trending away from that. I noticed some PMs stay in a role for a limited time before going to a different company. Do you know why a PM would hop often? I don't think there's any structural reason for that. If anything, lately it's just a hot job market. And so people are getting good opportunities. So they might be getting like a salary raise for jumping companies or something like that. Anonymous, how can I build a PM mindset without PM internship experiences? This is a great question. I either tweeted or mentioned something on LinkedIn about this the other day, which is like, my opinion is basically that product management, like being a PM, is a permissionless activity. Like no one needs to, bestow that title upon you. In my mind, the core hallmark of a product manager is someone that takes an idea, whatever that idea is, and does whatever is necessary to take it all the way through execution. And so no one needs to give you permission to do that. You can do that in your spare time. You can build a side project. You can go recruit an engineer, make it possible. Even if you go through that process and it's not software, like you're like, hey, I'm gonna go build a new Slack community. Just having the idea for what's the community, how you recruit people, how you get them in, how you change your strategies, you see what's working, what's not working. That's the iteration process, and ultimately like build a community. Like Dan and the folks at Earlywork, like they started, I think, by building this community. That's sort of like a product management thing. They had this idea and they made it happen. And so that's what I would recommend to Anon that asked that. Let's see. James, in the uni video conference example, to what extent do you think about the paying customer, the universe versus the end users? I think that's a really, really great question. I think we didn't touch much on this in our discussion, but if we were going through that question, I think it would be well worth, when you are in the phase where you're talking about who are our customers, what are their needs, is specifically talking about like, are we trying to build a product where we're selling to like, we're building a great product for universities that we already have relationships with, or are we trying to like convince universities to sign up for Google Workspace by building a great Meet product, and therefore like we should be making sure we're meeting their needs and what are their pain points, and their pain points might be more around like user security, privacy, administrative dashboards, so they know which professors are using it or not. Could take you down a whole different angle. So that's something in the early stages of that question, I think you want to, when you're talking about who are our customers, is, if you have a question about that, state that, or say like, hey, like I'm assuming that I should focus on university professors based off the way this question was phrased, but like, is it, are we not considering the university themselves, that type of thing, the procurement department. How long would you spend on a question like a Google Meet question? It depends a little bit, but a question like that would usually come in a product management interview, is probably maybe 30 minutes long, the total interview. And so, probably a little bit of chit chat in the beginning. Maybe it's about 20 minutes in that question. Some companies like to do longer ones. So you might be like a 45-minute interview. You may have like a proper like whole 30 minutes to walk through that. And as you're going through, like a lot of that time will get eaten up between dialogue between you and the interviewer usually. Where they're like asking some questions, you may be asking them some questions about like, hey, what are the goals? Or like, I was thinking this is a goal, and like that sort of banter back and forth. But I would say, quick answer would be somewhere between 20 to maybe 35, 40 minutes on the long run. I don't know how to pronounce this name, but Atef, hopefully I got that close. Not entirely related, but how much does having a CSM help for PM jobs? I can give you a quick sort of glib answer, which is like, I have no idea because I don't know what a CSM is, so maybe not much. Doesn't mean it doesn't.
Certified Scrum Master.
Certified Scrum Master. Oh, okay. My opinion on that doesn't matter at all. I've never seen anyone like in an interview process be like, oh, let's definitely talk to this candidate. They're a certified Scrum Master. I think at least like the culture in the States is that like Scrum isn't that complicated. It's just like a thing that you do. It's like you have a meeting with like, I don't think anyone cares about the certification. That's the short answer. How do you ramp up to a new PM role if you've never had any previous PM experience? So I'm going to assume the person asking this question is like, hey, I'm in the job, I'm trying to ramp up. I mean, there's a lot. What I would say is, if you're in the job and you're trying to figure out how to ramp up, sorry, I'm going to plug in my computer because running out of power. But if you are in the job and you're trying to figure out how to ramp up, I think that Focus on, try and do this. Like you got, let's say your first 2 weeks on the job, you're meeting people, you're figuring out like who's there, who's your team, what are the problems they're working on. Take a mindset of just finding a problem that people on your team have, finding a problem that's fixable, that you can do something about, and try and fix it. And then aside from that, like just like helping your team fix problems they have, that's like one of the most important things you can do as a product manager. You are, some people don't like to hear this, but essentially you are a glue function. You are not the person selling the software, and you are not the person coding the software. You're in like a perfectly functioning world, like your job would be unnecessary. Like the coders would just code it and the salespeople would sell it. Or if it's a consumer product, the marketers would just market it and would sell itself. But because the world is complicated and messy, you need product managers coordinating that in the middle. It's what makes the job so strange and so weird. And so like you wear so many different multiple hats because every company, every team, every product has different problems. Your job as a product manager is really to look around and figure out what's the most burning problem, and then figure out what you can do to help solve it. So if you're new to PM and you're trying to ramp up, you're not going to go wrong by just like looking around you and figuring out what's the most burning problem preventing my team from succeeding and trying to do something about it. Let's see, what else? Try and answer a few more here. I am applying for a product manager role, but I see a lot of product owner roles that are similar. Are they exclusively different? Does one report to another? This is a really good question. When I started working in product management, there was not like a thing called product owner. I feel like this has popped up more over time. Product owner roles tend to exist, as far as I can tell, at companies that are not they're not native tech companies. It's like, like a bank that now builds a lot of software, that type of thing. And product owners tend to be subordinate to product managers. So it tends to be like a lower role. It's a little more like execution focused, less like thinking about the actual strategy, more just like, hey, like working, like it's almost like a project role versus a product management role in my experience. Where would you start to transition careers from finance to PM? What I would do is, if you're trying to go from finance to product management, use your unfair advantage. You've been working in the finance industry. You probably know a decent amount about that particular industry. Maybe you know a lot about private wealth management or how credit card transactions work, something like that. Go find a tech company that is building in that particular space, that even though you haven't been a product manager, they'll value your domain expertise. When you're applying to a job as a product manager, there's like two big things you can bring to the table. One, like I'm an incredible generalist product manager and look at all this experience I have building and launching and shipping great products. Or I've got really really deep domain expertise in the area that you're trying to build in. So if you haven't been a career product manager, but you have a lot of domain expertise, use that to your unfair advantage. That makes you more attractive to that particular company than someone that's got maybe no domain expertise and a little bit of product management experience. In Melbourne, our CS degrees have two majors, advanced CS or data science. I was wondering which you think might be more beneficial for product managers. I'll give a quick answer to this question. I wouldn't take it too seriously one way or the other. I might lean towards data science because as a product manager, I think it's really important that you're analytical, that you can make decisions based off data. And I would just imagine that major gives you a little more experience digging into that versus say like CS might be a little more focused on like computer science principles, algorithms, things like that may be useful, but like at the end of the day, like your engineers are probably going to be writing that code and doing that on the job, but they may not be doing like the data science and analytical work, and some of that tends to cross over more to PM. So I might go with that one. And then let's see, I'm going to answer one last question. Let me scroll through, see what's left. Well, what does CS degree stand for? Computer science. During a PM interview, do you have the ability to write down some ideas and set a framework? So this is actually a really good question. A lot of people, I think, don't realize this. It's very, very well accepted to say, you get some question like the Google Meet question we were talking about, to just say, hey, like, do you mind if I take like 60 seconds to organize my thoughts around this? And I would highly recommend you do that. Anyone that's not cool with you doing that is probably going to be an unreasonable company or person to work for. So, take a little time, try and jot down your thoughts, try and organize them into some sort of framework. That will help you then walk through the rest of the interview in a more logical process, which your interviewer will appreciate. It'll make it easier to follow. And then here's the last thing I'll say on that. And this is, I think, maybe a good thing to end on. Even if you set forth a framework, like I had my framework to address that Google Meet question, maybe that's where I start the interview. Maybe I get like 2 steps into that framework and I'm talking through something. I'm like, oh shit. Like, actually, I realized like I was thinking about this the wrong way. Now that I'm like a little deeper into it, I think that there's actually a missing bucket, which I forgot to talk about, and I want to insert that. And this other thing, it's not as important, and I'm going to spend less time on that. It's perfectly understandable to call that out and say that. And in many instances, I think your interviewer will appreciate it, because they'll be like, oh, this person's not just like blindly following this thing they said in the beginning. They're actually like really engaging with the problem. And as they learn something new or thought about, something in a slightly different way, they're like, oh, I need to adjust. And that's exactly what happens on the job. And so showing you can do that in the interview as well is really, really powerful. So I'm going to end there. Thanks again for everyone for attending. Good questions. Thank you for participating. Thank you, and sorry to whoever, Naman, who got cold called, but good work rolling with the punches. And if you're going through interviews and looking for tools to help you prep, check us out at rocketblocks.me.
Awesome. Kenton, thank you so much. That was absolutely awesome, and really appreciate you taking some extra time to answer a bunch of questions from the audience. Folks, thank you so much for giving up an hour and a bit of your day to hop on and learn about product management interviews. We'll be looking to run kind of product type workshops and sessions every month for the Earlywork community. So if you have any suggestions on like areas of the role or areas of the interview process that you'd like kind of help with next, or you'd like to get more insight into, feel free to just kind of shoot me a message on the Earlywork Slack, drop them in the chat super quickly, but probably Slack's better so that they don't suddenly die like Zoom chat, which is not a great feature. And Kenton, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to improve Zoom chat at some point.
Yeah, it's got some real work for improvement.
Yeah, that PM's got some work to do for sure. Easy, folks. Have a beautiful day. Take care.
Bye-bye.